Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Robin Smith, president of the Cura Foundation, and on behalf of the Cura Foundation and the Jerusalem Ethics Forum, which is a joint initiative between the Galleon Foundation and the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, we want to welcome you to the second of a series of discussions around ethical dilemmas in healthcare. We're so honored to have with us 4 global leaders to discuss ethical dilemmas and the responsibility of regulators during a pandemic. The conversation will be moderated by the esteemed Dr. Andrew von Eschenbach, who served as commissioner of the FDA and as director of the NCI. Joining him is Amy Abernethy, the principal deputy commissioner and chief information officer at the FDA, and formerly CEO of Flatiron. We also have Joe Grogan, former assistant to the President of the United States and director of the Domestic Policy Council. And also with us is Murray, otherwise known as Mac Lumpkin, the current Deputy Director of Integrated Development and lead for Global Regulatory Systems Initiatives at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and former Director of the Anti-Infective Drug Division, Deputy Director of CDER, and Deputy Commissioner for the International Programs at the FDA. I know how busy you all are, and we appreciate your taking the time to be with us here today. Andy, I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Robin, and welcome to our audience. I'm really very privileged to be joined by 3 very distinguished colleagues who also happen to be very precious personal friends. We're all faced with the problems that this pandemic is creating for us, both from the point of view of scientific challenges, medical challenges, but there are also economic and societal challenges as well. And within each of those sectors, there are significant ethical and moral questions that may be emerging that I believe we can address in this next hour in a way that not only is informative, but actually provides an opportunity for you going forward to see where you might be engaged as we as a society struggle with the consequences of this worldwide pandemic. So let us begin. We've actually been here before. In 2005, when I was commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, we were faced with the threat of a global pandemic from H5N1, the bird flu or avian influenza. There had been transmission from birds to humans and beginning concerns about transmission from human to human, particularly in Asia. We here in the United States had all of the capacity for vaccine discovery and development and production, but we didn't have the virus. The human-to-human cases were in Asia. And I became aware of the fact that the leadership of Indonesia was considering refusing to provide the virus to us so that we could genetically dissect it and create the opportunity to produce vaccines. Essentially, they were holding the virus hostage until they could get assurances that we would be, once producing vaccines, would make them available to them as well, instead of keeping them for ourselves in the developed world. I kind of thought that holding the virus hostage when we were faced with a worldwide pandemic was both an ethical and a moral problem. But I also realized upon reflection that us depriving them of the benefits of vaccine development could also be a moral and ethical problem. And so we are now facing a real pandemic. This is occurring. This dangerous virus is creating and taking lives around the world and creating medical problems that are at this point in time an enormous struggle. And each of the panelists have been engaged in being able to try to come to grips with this problem. And so we will begin by asking each of them to just tell us what they see as probably one of the emerging or significant ethical problems that this pandemic is presenting to us. And Amy, let's begin with you. You are Principal Deputy and Chief Information Officer at FDA, and you're running in charge of and leading the FDA's Data Accelerator Initiative, where you're attempting to bring people together to share, to collaborate when they normally are competing, in order for us to accelerate the availability of diagnostics and therapeutics. As you're approaching that problem of acceleration being able to get these products to patients, being able to bring competitors together in a collaborative kind of way. What kind of issues are you seeing surface that may have an ethical dimension to them?
First of all, it's a huge honor to be here with you today and comment on such an important topic. Ethical dilemmas. So as I think about one of the biggest ethical dilemmas from my perspective, it's making decisions about how to treat the COVID-19 person sitting right in front of me, or how to make decisions in the context of COVID-19 with inadequate clinical evidence about what works for whom and when. And so we're forced to make a whole bunch of judgment calls on clinical decisions right now. And one of the ethical dilemmas is the challenge of the judgment call right now, especially if we don't have follow-up in some type of systematic way to understand the implications of the decisions we make right now, and how should that roll into making smarter and better decisions so we can improve the treatment of COVID-19 in the future. And that's really led to the book of work that has been advanced through the Reagan-Udall Foundation, Friends of Cancer Research, and with FDA, called the Evidence or Data Accelerator. Now, you pointed out that we've brought a whole bunch of data holders and analytic teams that have historically been competing to the table to try and help solve this challenge. And one of the issues is, how do we make this a safe space for everybody to operate, and for people to operate in a way that absolutely gets to the accurate answers? So first of all, we do basically leverage the urgency of COVID-19 and the value of coming to the table in a see and be seen kind of way. The participants in the Evidence Accelerator at this point recognize it's the place to be doing work together. So there is actually a value not to be left out, but also to make sure that when you show up, you do really good work, because you want to bring your best work to the table. Because if you're going to be seen, especially seen in a transparent way where everybody's best work is being brought to the table and then being examined by everybody else, you want to make sure that you bring your best work to the table. And so one of the ways we've dealt with the ethical challenge of competitors bringing their wares to the table is to make sure that there is a urgency about bringing your best data, your best analyses, and your best results to the table. We sort of treated this like a pre-competitive space in terms of pre-competitive development for clinical development. The other issue here is to ensure transparency. I think one of the things that we've seen all across the evidence generation space in the context of COVID-19, whether it was the Surgisphere and Lancet article or other data stories that have gone to print before the full work had been done, was the importance of getting the data right, getting the methods right, peer review and pressure testing results. And so we've used the Evidence Accelerator environment as a place to make sure transparent work happens and we get the data and methods right. Because I think one of the ethical challenges is if we get to what we think is an answer before the hard work of getting the data right and the analysis right actually takes place. And then what happens is we get the wrong answer into the hands of patients and doctors. So that one ethical challenge is making sure we have enough evidence. Another ethical challenge is making sure that we do the right work to generate the evidence.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. Joe, you've been at the center of power, assistant to the president, head of our domestic policy council. You've been at the table for the pandemic task force, and you've been a part of the dissemination of billions of dollars to industry in order to accelerate the infrastructure so that we would have a vaccine. What was inherent in being able to put all that money out there and wonder whether there was going to be an equitable return on that investment? How do you deal with the issues of who gets it, who doesn't get it? What kind of ethical issues did you see emerging as you had to build infrastructure and disseminate in a very rapid way enormous amounts of resources?
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for having me on the panel. I think that the entry point to the discussion when you're making the decisions is first and foremost, the ethical challenges are really hard. We're all aware of how difficult the scientific challenges are, but we're hoping there's a right answer at the end or several right answers. On a lot of these ethical questions that you're facing, there is not going to be a right answer, and you just have to do the best you can. In allocating the money, to be frank, the first ethical challenge you face is how much are you willing to waste, frankly, because in an epidemic like this, a pandemic, normally if the government was investing money in a vaccine development program, you'd be much more methodical, deliberate, and in staging. Well, we need this much information, and then we need to move on to the next stage and the next stage, and you've got a longer time horizon. Here, Congress was willing to dump tons of money. The president was willing to ask for tons of money to take as many shots on goal with the expectation that a fair amount of money may get wasted, and you go down rabbit holes or scientific pursuits that don't end up bearing fruit. And while we're all hopeful right now that we will get the therapies and the vaccines we need, you have to be realistic and remember most of these efforts fail more than they succeed. So we are going to be squandering resources in some aspects of this response. If some of the targets hit, great, it's well worth it, and nobody will hold that against us. But figuring out how it's allocated, in contrast to your Indonesia example, I think is very interesting in this time, because Indonesia didn't have a drug development program in place, right? But here we have a number of international players who are also in the race to get therapy. The Europeans, the Chinese are working on it. And if we misstep here and develop suddenly invite a trade war on a very sophisticated supply chain in the pharmaceutical and vaccine development space, it could end up backfiring on the United States, because we may lose the race. I hope the United States, an American company and American taxpayer dollars, are the engine to get us across the finish line first. But we have to recognize maybe not. Maybe the Europeans beat us. And if we've restricted the flow of some information or supply that the Europeans have requested, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and they may restrict access to us. The same thing with the Chinese. They were not transparent in their public health data before. That, in my opinion, was unethical in not sharing it more widely with the world. But we can't count on them to be wrestling with the ethical challenges in the same way that we do. So I think that the first point is these are really difficult challenges with no particular right answer. The pitfalls and the danger of making a wrong decision is pretty grave in this situation, and we have to do the best we can and recognize that these are hard questions.
Thank you, Joe. Mac, you've been at Gates. When you were at FDA, you were running our international programs dealing with regulators around the world and leadership in governments around the world. And you've always been mindful of the haves and the have-nots, those areas where there's tremendous strength, like in the United States, and then other places where there's tremendous need. What do you see emerging in this particular pandemic as significant ethical issues that are affecting us from a global perspective?
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to all of you who put this conference together for inviting me to be a part of it. As Andy said, at this point, working with the Gates Foundation, we're focusing primarily on how this pandemic is affecting low-income countries. And I think one of the really interesting ethical issues that's now beginning to develop, particularly as the number of patients that are available in Europe, or at least during this first wave, in Europe and in China, and hopefully here in the United States, starts going down. People are looking now and are beginning and are already implementing clinical trials in Africa and other low-income country settings where the numbers of cases are continuing to rise. And the ethical issue that that brings up is that I think, as we all know, the social contract has always been in clinical research that while we cannot guarantee benefit to the individual participant, we do guarantee that the communities that participate will benefit from the knowledge that comes out of the clinical trial. And as the communities in these low-income countries now are in the clinical trials that will inform the data sets that let us know which products are indeed effective or not, I think there is a very strong moral obligation that they also benefit when we do have a product that is available. And as we all know, that's not been the case historically. There have been questions about equitable access, both not only in terms of cost, but I think this time around, the issue is going to be more in terms of timing and the ethics of when different populations on this planet have access to whatever medical intervention ultimately gets shown to offer benefit. I think one of the real differences this time is when we, for example, were dealing with Ebola or when we were dealing with Zika, these were epidemics, but they were geographically limited. We've got a pandemic now where the reality and the expectation is that when the magic bullet is found, 7 billion people are going to want access essentially simultaneously to that magic bullet. And as we all know, the capacity issue for actually manufacturing 7 billion doses of whatever it is going to be huge. And so there are real ethical issues about kind of how we time access, how we assure access, how we explain access, not only within our own countries, but within the global context. And I think that's what I see as kind of in the developing world context, the overriding ethical issue at this point.
Well, no surprise that in just a very few minutes, the three of you have put on the table one, deep insights into the problem, but really significant issues to kind of come to grips with. So let's focus on this piece of the equation of clinical development and clinical access. We've got the issue of clinical trials and the data that has to emerge from that. We've got the issue of once we use that information and develop products, they have to be disseminated in an equitable kind of way. We're hearing things like in anticipation of that, I think President Macron said that maybe export barriers would have to be put in place so that he could assure that his country got the benefits of the vaccine before it was exported. We see efforts to pre-purchase, if you will, or fund in a way. What issues do you see around this need to create some mechanism? What should that mechanism look like? Who should do it? How's it get done? To deal with this issue that you're all touching on, which is once there is a solution, how do we, in an ethical, appropriate kind of way, disseminate that solution? Thoughts?
Well, Andy, I mean, one thing that we're focused on, I think, is, yes, there is the issue that we've all heard that you've brought up of this threatened vaccine nationalism and export controls and all of that. But I think even in light of that, if you start thinking of the capacity that the manufacturing facilities have in these various places, even without an export control, just having the product available in sufficient quantity to export it to all corners of the earth is probably not a reality at this point. And so what we're also beginning to think about is, well, there will be a version of the magic bullet that the FDA sees, or that the EMA sees, or that the Chinese government sees. But the reality for the countries we focus on is that that version will probably not be the version that is available in the low-income countries simply because of the capacity to manufacture issues. So there are going to be other manufacturers who either legally or illegally, once it's known what the magic bullet is, decide they're going to produce their version of it. And they're going to make that version of the product available to countries that don't have the ability to get it from others. And the question comes in at that point, if this is not a version that a regulator who knows how to oversee vaccine production and who understands the complexities of vaccine production, who's going to be looking at that? And who's going to assure that these other versions of whatever the magic bullet is are indeed quality versions, and that people are not going to be harmed by them, and that they're going to do the good that we expect? And so I think one of the challenges is not only to ensure that people get access to the product, but they get access to a quality version of the product, knowing that in reality, it's probably going to come from a host of different manufacturers. And as we all know, you can do that much more easily with a small molecule. With something as complex as a vaccine, that becomes really, really difficult to assure the quality and the equivalence of different versions. But that's going to be one of the scientific challenges, one of the logistical challenges, and I think one of the ethical challenges that we are faced with globally.
Amy, you want to pick up on that from the perspective of some of the things that you're engaged in now and addressing that?
I wanted to hit on a couple of things. One is, not only is there the potential for different versions, we also need to think broadly about what might be safe and effective. And one of the things I've been struck by in the work that we've been doing is that there are some repurposed medicines in particular that may have effectiveness within the context of COVID-19 and also be literally sub-pennies in order to make available. And so making sure that we've thought broadly about what's available, not just that's on patent, but sort of has biological plausibility, safety, and effectiveness, and can be available to the entire world. So that's one thing. And we've seen some interesting work happening in this space. Really incredible information coming out of the basic science labs that then lead to understanding of how repurposed drugs perform in the context of COVID-19, now informing clinical trials that will help us understand how some of these repurposed drugs actually perform in a true effectiveness context. The second thing that I would say is that as we move into a space where we're potentially needing to deliver at scale, we need to be able to practice how to deliver with as little waste as possible. I sort of reflect on a lot of the stuff that's happened within the context of the PPE space as we were trying to move things around quickly and get it right. And we had product going sometimes to the wrong places, and just trying to get it right was a normal byproduct of the urgency and the timing of figuring it all out. But as we move forward with vaccine delivery, therapeutic delivery, PPE of the future, we need to be able to position treatments, solutions where they need to be and reduce waste, including the need to dispose of drugs or vaccines. The last thing that I would say is, in the line with reducing the risk of waste, we also need to do the work of understanding what works for whom and when. My expectation is that in the context of COVID-19, we're going to end up at one point or another with a series of subclinical scenarios that are different clinical scenarios requiring different combinations of drugs or requires taking care of patients in different ways. That's actually going to help us not only personalize therapy within the context of COVID-19, but it's going to make us smarter about how to get treatments to the right groups and also reduce the chance that ineffective therapies are being delivered to those patients. So we need to start figuring that out. Practical example is which patients need anticoagulants and how do we predict that and how do we marry that with the rest of any clinical regimen for those patients. So I think that that's going to be one of the sort of important things as we think about managing these patients going forward and reducing the chance that patients get ineffective therapies, and we really only focus on the effective ones.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an ethical responsibility to use the resources we have to make sure that what's being developed is of quality and avoid some of the problems that Mac was alluding to with regard to the insertion of counterfeits or products that are being sold by snake oil salesmen, so to speak. We have to work towards a more equitable distribution of those products once they are available. Joe, what's the role of government in addressing the ethical dimensions of that? What do we do as a very prosperous nation, a very powerful nation, one that has enormous resources scientifically, medically, et cetera? What's our ethical responsibility to the rest of the world?
Well, first and foremost, I think we have to step in and lead here and begin to convene people around this difficult problem, both here in the United States and internationally. I mean, back to Mac's point about trying to figure out how we're going to deploy these therapies and vaccines to the developing world, even if we start to get in 2020, beginning of 2021, a successful vaccine candidate, we won't have enough capacity for everybody in the United States or everybody even in France or in Germany. So who gets it? There might be limited clinical data at that point. Now, where we are in the pandemic, people are willing to tolerate more risk, both from the political perspective, but also individually consulting with their doctors. But is this a situation where we consult with the FDA and the other regulators and say, only healthy people should get it at this point, even though it's really attacking the seniors and people with vulnerable immune systems? So that is an initial question based upon the risk-benefit analysis that we're going to have to answer. If it's only healthy people should get it in the first round, I would think the United States military and other militaries would be first in line to say, we have a ton of young, healthy people that we need to make sure are going to be healthy, because we can't have an entire aircraft carrier battle group go down, for instance, or 3 divisions somewhere deployed overseas go down. That in and of itself is going to create a huge political problem if we were to say, sure, we're going to give it to the military first because they have healthy people. It would create, talk about civil strife that we've got going on in our streets now. If you start to deploy it in a way just for healthy people and happen to be in the military, you're going to have a huge problem on your hands. So I think we've got to start to convene people in the United States and have this discussion that you're having today in a broader way with CDC. To Amy's point, talking about waste, CDC is the ones that normally would be involved, have the expertise in deploying this, the public health relationships, so that they can figure out in advance how it would be deployed, how many people, how many doses they're planning for, and are we going to start with healthy people or with the vulnerable, point number one, or do we start economically? We are having tremendous economic stress in this country. Do you go in and inoculate everybody working in a meat packing plant or a food processing plant first, because that's been determined to be critical infrastructure, or everybody at the ports that are unloading our ships to keep the supply chain up and running? These are not easy questions. They're going to be informed by the data that Amy and the team at FDA have about the risk-benefit analysis, but we've got to get ahead on the logistics and the thinking through of who's going to get it first here in the United States and with our partner regulators around the world, and make sure that nobody does a misstep, back to my first point, and we engage not in a rational discussion or on an ethical way to distribute the drug, but in a mindless trade war that takes forever for us to sort out and creates tons of problems for us. Because as Mac was talking about capacity, the vials to make a vaccine might be in Germany and some excipient is in the United States that we need, and France has the manufacturing capacity, or you need the Japanese to cook something. And if none of these people are talking to one another, we are going to have a major problem on our hands.
So who decides?
Well, I think, you're going to have to get people in a room together quietly with a lot of cameras and start to figure out. FDA is going to have to be at the table. You would have to have the highest reaches of a designated person by the prime minister or the president, or whoever from the countries that is going to be involved in it, and it's going to have to be somebody some people who are very thoughtful to think through how to do this. And it's going to evolve, I bet, because
For Amy and all three of you, what's the role of the regulator? Does FDA take a lead here? How does that work?
Andy, I think we have to be realistic, as at least from my perspective, what regulators do. Regulators will be able to tell the community this particular manufacturer is making a version of this product that we believe is safe and effective and manufactured at an international quality standard. Regulators don't tell you, and you should give it to person A, B, C, or D. There are policy people within communities that make that decision. I think we even know within the United States, for example, with a vaccine, FDA will say that a vaccine is safe and effective, but it's the CDC's ACIP that comes together to decide whether that vaccine should be in the national vaccine program or not. So these are different. And I think Joe made a good point that, everybody's going to look at this from their own perspective of risk and the risk they're willing to tolerate. And I think if you're a frontline healthcare worker, you think, I'm pretty much at high risk here. I should be at the first of the line. If you're a first responder, you're probably thinking, I'm high risk. If you're a worker in a nursing home, you think, I'm at high risk, and my patients are at very high risk. And if you have a family member that's in a nursing home, that's where the risk is. If you want to eat, the risk is in the pork factories and the meat factories and the chicken factories. So, as Joe was saying, different parts of the community are going to look at this risk equation and see it through their lens and think their lens is the one that everybody's going to see it through. And you just can't do it that way. As Joe was pointing out, you got to get these on the table, but then somebody has to be able, whether it's the president, the secretary, whoever it is, has to be able to say, this is how much we have, this is how it's going to be allocated, and as Amy pointed out, transparently, why this is the way it's going to be done. So that you might agree, you might disagree, but and I think most importantly, be able to tell people when they're going to fit into the queue. Just saying, all we have is this amount, and we're going to do 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the queue, but not be able to tell people realistically when we expect to do 5, 6, and 7 is going to create incredible anxiety and the problems I think Joe was alluding to.
Amy?
A couple of pieces. One of the things Mac brought up is that as regulators, we're able to help provide the insight that this particular product has made it across the line with respect to what we know right now from the perspective of safety and effectiveness. Whether or not that across the line is defined by all of the clinical data we'd ever have wanted to see, or limited information that then needs to be continuously filled in across time is one of the things that we can provide insight about. But then that information needs to be provided within the context of a number of other elements to the decision making. And this sort of criticality of getting around the table and having an honest and transparent discussion is sort of critical point number 2. So the regulators provide, here's where we are, and this is what we know and what we don't know, and the level of confidence we've got to go forward. The around the table is the transparent discussion. But the third thing that you heard here over and over again is the importance of leadership and the importance of being able to have a safe space, but where leadership can become clear in that conversation. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about as I've been listening to this conversation is that, if we look back to March, when we were watching the story unfold in Italy and then in New York City, in making decisions or potentially needing to make decisions around who received ventilators within the context of hospitals, it was actually sort of a microcosm of the need to start figuring out how to be very explicit around the decision making we were going to have, so that when it gets urgent and stressful, we've got a really clear order of work that we've been able to think through and really kind of pressure test from all sides. And I think that microcosm of Italy and New York City in March is now going to play out potentially on a world stage at one point or another in our future, as we think about needing to distribute, for example, vaccines, and being able to really start figuring out how to do that hard work now of defining what that table looks like and what leadership looks like, and the questions to be answered is one of the things we need to do now.
So let me, in terms of this buy-in, let me put it on a macro and a micro level. On a macro level, if we fund vaccine development, or if we provide the intellectual capital for vaccine development, does that, if you will, give us first dibs, whoever we are, whether it's our country or other country? Should that enable somebody to have first dibs on the macro level? What about on the micro level? If we define what some of these categories are, but as you point out, there's going to be kind of a rolling emergence of these products. There'll probably be many of them. They'll be coming in various stages with varying degrees of evidence behind them. Should we require people to buy in by saying, if we give you this vaccine, you must give us your data. You must allow us to follow you, to be able to include you in an outcome clinical trial. And if you don't agree to that, you're not going to get the vaccine because we need the data. What conditions on the macro, micro level do the three of you think are ethically appropriate to put onto a scarce resource as you're trying to disseminate it, assuming yet you've created some hierarchy, first responders, et cetera, assuming that within those, what are the other ethical parameters that you can put on that require a quid pro quo?
Well, to the first point, Andy, I think, let's play the scenario out that one of the companies that the United States is funding principally, and so it's the most jingoistic scenario possible. It's our money, American company, all the manufacturing is in the United States, and we think that they've got a successful vaccine in September with, most rosy scenario. To Mac's point, I don't see how anybody is going to be able to take care of everybody in the United States. And if, to Amy's point, we're being transparent about the data, I don't see how there aren't countries outside of the United States who don't raise their hand and say, we can manufacture this as well and contribute to the solution both in the United States and around the world. So if we're being transparent about the data, yes, we've run the table on not needing any foreign assets for this vaccine development, which I'm not sure that there is a scenario that you don't need some equipment to cook this thing, research it, grow it, increase its scale. You don't need something from the Germans for your manufacturing plant. You don't need some scientists from Italy to come and augment. I just don't see a scenario where you don't need people outside of the United States to contribute to the solution, even just for the United States. So yes, we can lead the discussion and say Pfizer's going to hit on their solution. They're going to be way ahead of the game. And maybe that gives us convening authority, but we're going to need help from other people so that they don't restrict the flow of information and not be as transparent, and the flow of people and expertise and equipment that we're going to need. And in that discussion, I don't see how we're not going to have to say, this country X, you're going to get 20% of this supply coming out of this production. Maybe it starts at 2% and moves to 5 and goes to 20, and another country's going to get something. I just don't see a scenario where we don't have to share some of the production if we're being rational about it. I'm not saying that we can't get into a war of words with foreign countries, and they're saying, we're not going to give you the machine you need to make this stuff unless we get 50% of your supply. That may not be fair, and we're going to need a discussion with foreign regulators and foreign leaders on how to think this through and come up with a distribution, but it's going to happen.
Andy, I think both you and Amy made a very good point about kind of, the thought process when we get to the point when we have a certain amount of product available. And, the point Amy made several times here is that realistically, we're not going to know everything we want to know about that product at the time it's available in whatever this first quantity is. And I think we have to be, again, going back to the ethical issues here, we have to be absolutely transparent and forthcoming with the recipients as to what we know and what we don't know. I mean, we've all heard the question being raised about coronavirus vaccines and whether they exacerbate disease or whether they mitigate disease. And there's a real question whether we will know the answer to that with this vaccine when we get to this point. So from an ethical point of view, you obviously have to let people know what you don't know and what your concerns are. And it goes to your question about participating. In a way, it's just another step in the learning process about these. And, I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask people that if they're going to be in it at that point, they have to be part of the overall learning equation here. And we are all still going to be learning about these products at that point. To this issue of cost, I think at some point we have got to say the data around these products are really the agglomeration of a global input of information, and that the manufacturing of these products, they are global commodities. Whether you go back and say at some point somebody did the initial gene sequencing and we've marched on from that. And so, there has been, as Joe's pointed out, incredible global input into our knowledge base that has allowed whomever to make it. And so for somebody to claim this is ours 100% just denies the reality of how we got to that point.
And I'd like to add a couple of quick pieces. The first is kind of going along with Mac's point around there are going to be things that we don't know. Some of those things that we don't know may be quite harmful. I was just imagining when Joe was talking the scenario of us giving a vaccine to our military first, only to find out that there is a substantial group of individuals that develop Guillain-Barré syndrome that we didn't expect as some type of late effect or something else. And we suddenly have run into those kinds of challenges. And so importantly, as you imagine the conversation at the table, playing out the different scenarios and coming up with a transparent way forward, one of those transparent conversations are the what if scenarios of the things that we don't know. I don't have anything to add on the macro because I think Joe said it very well, that at the macro level, I can't imagine right now a scenario where 100% of the capability to solve this sits in the United States because we are at this point so globally interconnected. But practically speaking, as I think about this micro scenario, and as Mac was talking about, we should be able to learn along with you. I think one of the ethical challenges that I would like to put on the table that we need to think our way through is in the context of learning along with you and collecting the data, we also still need to figure out how to respect essentially the rules and the approaches that are seen around the world. And right now, sort of the one that's in my mind is GDPR, just because that's sort of one of the examples around management of privacy. And I think it's up to us right now to think about how are we going to solve for these things, so that as we move forward, we thought about what are the ethical and privacy dilemmas we want to make sure we've dealt, saying we want your data, we want to learn with you, and you're going to have to do it our way. But what are the right ways that we can do this together, and what are the innovations we need to bring to the table in order to solve for that as we move forward?
So we have one hierarchy that could be based on what I might describe as need, i.e. first responders who need protection in order to help others, maybe the military, maybe people working in critical industries, etc. What about the regulator imposing a different stratification that said we want different kinds of populations included in the first wave of vaccine distribution, so that we can extract regulatory information about what's working in what population and in what way and what reasons, so we can keep the regulatory process fueling the development process for the next iteration. Do you see the regulator playing a role in helping to define subsets based on what the scientific questions are or needs are for the next version around a safe and effective vaccine?
Andy, one of the real challenges we have in looking at low-income countries is exactly what you're talking about, where you have to begin to think, can you extrapolate the clinical efficacy and safety data from high-income country populations to low-income country populations when you have a huge amount of the population that is positive for HIV, that is positive for malaria, that is positive for tuberculosis, that has malnutrition, all of which depress the immune system. And you start wondering, so how is this disease going to manifest in those populations, and how is a vaccine going to manifest in those populations? And the ability to extrapolate safety and efficacy data from a population that doesn't have those underlying situations is really, really challenging. The other challenge we have ethically is looking at the populations and whether, when you start, as Amy talks about being transparent, and when in ethics we talk about consent, and what does it mean to consent and who can consent when a large part of your community is illiterate and a written informed consent document simply doesn't work, is not feasible, when a large part of your community has different gender roles than what we see in high-income countries, and issues of consent and within a community on consent. These are the kinds of things that you wonder, and you add on top of that, in a community where medical care is hard to come by, whether it's in high-income countries or low-income countries, and you're offering something to somebody, is that in and of itself coercive? And when do you get into a coercive situation when you're trying to make something available and you're still trying to learn about what happens in different communities? Thank you.
Well, Andy, I thought what you said was interesting, because if I interpreted it right, are you suggesting that maybe FDA or the EMA or a regulator could, in fact, impose an ethical distribution scheme with a phase 4 study, for instance, because you've got less data than you would normally have in the development of a vaccine in the first tranche, probably with I don't know what all the populations look like that everybody's doing their clinical data, gathering their clinical data on, but it probably isn't going to be reflective of the worldwide population that's affected by the virus. So in your phase 4 data, you say, okay, great, you had mostly Caucasians in the United States for this data set, say healthcare workers in urban centers, but you don't have, it doesn't reflect the ethnic and genetic diversity of the world. And to Mac's point, some of the comorbidities that are reflected. So when you deploy it, we're going to make sure that you have to deploy X amount in this type of resource deprived environment, this amount in this environment that's got more genetic diversity, these underlying comorbidities. So in an effect, a REMS or a phase 4 study could be an ethical overlay as mandated by FDA.
Amy, you want to comment on it?
So I don't want to predict what's going to happen, but I think that is a very nice way of describing it, Joe. I mean, practically speaking, we may end up in a scenario where we have gaps in our knowledge and can now use the post-approval setting defined on whatever type of approval there is to now start to systematically fill in those gaps. And I don't think that is a ridiculous idea. I want to make sure that, I acknowledge right now that I don't know what that approval will look like, nor do am I able to sort of predict what those requirements could or should look like. But, practically speaking, that's what I see as a potential way forward.
Yeah, where I was going with the discussion was, there's the obligation of society to the individual, and then there's the obligation of the individual to society. So from a societal point of view, whether it's our government or our leadership, like the Gates, et cetera, really being sure that we're addressing the ethical and moral issues with regard to equitable distribution, fairness, transparency, et cetera. That's society's obligation to the individual. But in a situation where knowledge is incomplete, where there's so much more that needs to be learned and done, and where resources are scarce, if you get the vaccine first because you happen to be in that selected group, someone else is not getting it. And there comes a moral obligation of the individual to society to say, if I'm going to be privileged to get it, I should contribute back. And one way to do that is to contribute to the clinical ongoing evaluation of that vaccine. So I see it as ethical questions that go both ways, from society to the individual and the individual to society.
Can I just take that for 1 second, Andy, though? I apologize because there's a storm outside the window, and so a little bit of the last bit went out. But, as I've been watching this story play out, and I think you've seen some of this too, while I 100% agree with you, there needs to be the right checks and balances, and we need to keep track of each other. One of the things that I've seen is within the urgency of COVID-19, there oftentimes be the statement of dealing with those issues of privacy or confidentiality are just too hard. Let's get the rules to bypass it and keep on going. And while there are going to be times when we need to find ways to create the expectation that one contributes to the legacy of knowledge as we do this work going forward, we also need to create the expectations of ourselves that we don't just bypass the rules because it's the expedient thing to do. We're really thoughtful about how we do this in a way that preserves personhood. And so I feel like we need to be thoughtful on both sides of that equation.
Great point. And I see Robin's joined us.
Yes.
So as our host, and I think we're coming to the close.
As the webinar is coming to a close, I really can't thank you enough, all of you, our esteemed moderator and 3 incredible panelists, for taking the time to discuss the ethical dilemmas and the responsibility of regulators during a pandemic. To all of the participants, we'll be sending you a questionnaire later today, and we hope you'll take a minute to give us the feedback so that we can always improve what we do and serve our participants in the best way possible. In the meantime, to all of you, you and your families, please be safe and be healthy, and we look forward to continuing the discussion of ethical dilemmas in healthcare.